The sun hung low over the Montana Territory, painting the endless plains in shades of copper and gold. Samuel Whitmore guided his weathered mare, Dolly, along the rutted path that led back to his modest homestead. At 43, Samuel had the lean, weathered look of a man who'd spent 2 decades fighting the harsh realities of frontier life. His calloused hands gripped the reins loosely, his grey eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced vigilance of someone who'd learned that the West never truly slept. The autumn of 1887 had been particularly unforgiving. 3 failed harvests in as many years had driven most of his neighbors eastward, back to the relative safety of civilization. But Samuel remained, stubborn as the sagebrush that clung to the rocky soil of his 160-acre claim. This land was all he had left of his dreams, all that remained of the life he'd once imagined building with Martha, before consumption took her 5 winters past. As Dolly's hooves clicked against the scattered stones, Samuel's thoughts turned to the dwindling supplies in his root cellar. Tomorrow, he'd have to make the journey to Copper Falls, the nearest settlement, to trade what little he could spare for the essentials that would see him through another harsh Montana winter. It was a 2-day ride each way, but necessary. The isolation that had once been his refuge now threatened to become his tomb. The familiar landmarks of home came into view. The weathered barn where he kept his few remaining cattle, the modest log cabin he'd built with his own hands, the well that had never run dry even in the driest summers. But something felt different today. Dolly seemed skittish, her ears twitching nervously as they approached the property line. Samuel reined in his horse, studying the terrain with heightened attention. Years of living alone had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. The slightest disturbance in his routine could mean the difference between life and death out here. Bandits, wild animals, harsh weather. The frontier demanded constant vigilance. That's when he noticed the tracks. Fresh horse prints crossed his property, leading toward the notorious ghost trail that snaked through the canyon just beyond his northern fence line. Samuel's jaw tightened. The ghost trail had earned its ominous name not through supernatural means, but through very real dangers. The narrow path wound through treacherous terrain where rockslides were common, where outlaws often ambushed travelers, and where more than one person had simply vanished without a trace. Local settlers avoided it religiously, preferring to take the longer, safer route around the canyon. Dismounting, Samuel knelt beside the tracks. Multiple horses, unshod, likely Indian ponies. But these weren't the random wanderings of a hunting party. The deliberate spacing and direction suggested urgency, perhaps even desperation. His brow furrowed as he followed the trail with his eyes toward the canyon's mouth. The smart thing would be to ignore it. Whatever business had driven riders onto the ghost trail was none of his concern. Samuel had learned long ago that survival often meant minding one's own affairs and letting others handle their troubles. But something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. As the last rays of sunlight began to fade, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. Leading Dolly by the reins, he followed the tracks toward the canyon. The ghost trail stretched before him like a scar across the landscape, its rocky walls rising on either side to block out the dying light. The silence was oppressive. Even Dolly seemed to sense the weight of the place, her breathing shallow and quick. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the worn grip of his Colt revolver, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. Violence had never been his nature, but the frontier had a way of forcing such choices upon a man. 20 minutes into the canyon, Samuel spotted something that made his blood run cold. Sprawled beside a cluster of boulders, barely visible in the gathering darkness, was a small figure. At first glance, he thought it might be a discarded bundle of clothing, but as he drew closer, the terrible truth became clear. It was a young girl, probably no more than 16 or 17 years old. Her dark hair was matted with dust and dried blood, her clothes torn and dirty. She lay motionless, and for a heart-stopping moment Samuel feared she was dead. But as he knelt beside her, he detected the faint rise and fall of her chest. Miss, can you hear me?" Samuel's voice echoed softly off the canyon walls. The girl's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises filled with pain and confusion. She tried to speak, but only managed a soft moan. Something was wrong with her mouth. Blood crusted around her lips suggested injury, but as Samuel looked closer, he realized the truth might be even more troubling. The girl's clothing, while torn and dirty, showed the distinctive beadwork and leather craftsmanship of Native American origin. Her features, too, suggested tribal heritage. But more importantly, when Samuel spoke to her again, there was no recognition in her eyes, no indication that she understood his words. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. Had she been thrown from a horse, attacked by bandits, left here to die by her own people? The tracks he'd followed suggested multiple riders, but now there was only this injured girl, alone and helpless, in one of the most dangerous places in the territory. Gently, Samuel examined her injuries. A nasty gash on her forehead had bled considerably, but seemed to be clotting. Her left ankle was swollen, possibly sprained or broken. But what concerned him most were the rope burns around her wrists, clear evidence that she'd been bound against her will. "Easy now," Samuel murmured, knowing she probably couldn't hear him, but hoping his tone might provide some comfort. "You're safe now. I'm going to help you." As carefully as possible, Samuel lifted the girl into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, probably weakened by hunger and dehydration, as well as her injuries. Dolly whinnied nervously as he approached, but the old mare held steady as Samuel managed to settle the girl across the saddle. The journey back to his homestead felt endless. Samuel walked alongside Dolly, one hand steadying the unconscious girl, while the other held the reins. The darkness was nearly complete now, forcing him to rely on memory and instinct to navigate the familiar path home. Questions swirled through his mind with each step. Who was this girl? Why had she been left on the ghost trail? And perhaps most importantly, what would he do with her once he got her to safety? Taking in a stranger, especially a Native American girl, could bring trouble from multiple directions. The territorial authorities, local settlers, even her own people might view his actions with suspicion. But Samuel had made his choice back in that canyon, and he wasn't a man to second-guess himself. Whatever consequences might follow, he couldn't have left her there to die. Some things mattered more than personal safety, and basic human decency was one of them. As his cabin came into view, Samuel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The hard part was just beginning. Samuel carried the unconscious girl through the doorway of his modest cabin, her slight frame barely weighing down his weathered arms. The familiar scent of wood smoke and coffee grounds greeted him, along with the flickering warmth of the oil lamp he'd left burning on the kitchen table. For the first time in years, his solitary home felt different, no longer just a shelter, but a sanctuary for someone in desperate need. Gently he laid her on his narrow bed, the only proper sleeping place in the single-room cabin. The girl's breathing remained shallow but steady, and in the better light, Samuel could see more clearly the extent of her injuries. The dried blood around her mouth told a story he was beginning to understand. When he'd spoken to her in the canyon, there had been no startled response, no turn of her head toward his voice. Combined with what appeared to be old scars around her throat, the evidence pointed to a troubling conclusion. She was deaf, and possibly mute as well. Samuel had encountered deaf individuals before. His own cousin Benjamin had lost his hearing to scarlet fever as a child. The family had learned to communicate through gestures and written words, though Benjamin had eventually moved to a special school back east. But this girl was different. She was Native American, likely from one of the tribes that still roamed the northern territories, and her presence here suggested a story far more complicated than simple misfortune. Rolling up his sleeves, Samuel set about gathering supplies. His medical knowledge was limited to the practical skills any frontier settler acquired, treating cuts, setting bones, and dealing with fevers. Martha had been the one with the gentle touch for healing, but she'd taught him enough before the consumption took her. From his meager stores, Samuel retrieved clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey for disinfectant, and the last of his precious store-bought soap. He filled a basin with water from the well, warming it over the fire until it was comfortable to the touch. The girl needed cleaning before he could properly assess and treat her wounds. Working with the utmost care and respect, Samuel began cleaning the dirt and blood from her face and hands. Her dark skin was marked with bruises in various stages of healing, some fresh from recent trauma, others older and yellowing. The rope burns on her wrists were raw and angry, suggesting she'd struggled against her bonds before being abandoned. As he worked, Samuel found himself studying her features. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 15 or 16 at most. Her face, though marred by injury and exhaustion, held a quiet dignity that reminded him of the few tribal representatives he'd met during his early years in the territory. There was strength there, even in unconsciousness, the kind of resilience that came from surviving hardships most people couldn't imagine. The girl stirred as Samuel cleaned the gash on her forehead, her eyes fluttering open to reveal confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, panic flooding her features as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. Samuel held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid startling her further. "Easy," he said softly, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "You're safe, no one's going to hurt you." The girl's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn furniture, the dying fire in the stone hearth, and Samuel's weathered face. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, and Samuel noticed the way she seemed to be testing her voice, though no sound emerged. When their eyes met, he saw intelligence there, and calculation. She was assessing him, trying to determine if he represented safety or a new kind of danger. Slowly, Samuel pointed to himself and said, "Samuel." Then he pointed to her with a questioning expression. The girl watched his movements carefully, and after a moment she seemed to understand. She touched her chest and moved her lips, but again, no sound came. Her face tightened with frustration, and Samuel could see the pain of her inability to communicate in the conventional way. Then the girl did something that surprised him. She held up one finger, asking him to wait, then began moving her hands in deliberate, flowing gestures. It was sign language, but not the simple hand-spelling Samuel had learned with his cousin. These were complex movements that seemed to tell a story, her fingers dancing through shapes and patterns that spoke of wind and water, of running and fear. Samuel watched, fascinated despite himself. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly, but he could only shake his head apologetically. The girl's shoulders sagged with disappointment, but then her expression brightened with an idea. She pointed to the cabin's single window, then made a circular motion with her finger, followed by a gesture that clearly represented the sun rising. "Morning," Samuel guessed. "You want to know if it's morning?" The girl nodded eagerly, then held up her hands to frame her face, squinting as if looking into bright light. She was asking about the time, trying to understand how long she'd been unconscious and where she was in relation to her own journey. Samuel pointed to the window where the deep blue of night was still visible. Then he made a sleeping gesture, laying his head on his hands, followed by pointing to the window again and making the rising sun motion she'd used. "Tomorrow morning." Understanding flickered in her dark eyes, followed by something that might have been relief. She was safe for now, at least until daylight, but then her expression grew troubled, and she began another series of gestures. These were more urgent, more desperate. She pointed in various directions, made running motions with her fingers, and touched her heart with both hands in what Samuel interpreted as deep concern. "You're worried about someone," Samuel said aloud, more for his own benefit than hers. "Your family." The girl nodded vigorously, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed many people. A large group, her tribe, Samuel realized. They would be looking for her, and her disappearance would cause them great concern. But the rope burns, and her condition when he'd found her suggested she hadn't left willingly. Someone had taken her, and someone had abandoned her to die on the ghost trail. Samuel's jaw tightened as the implications became clear. Kidnappers had taken this girl, probably intending to sell her or worse. When she became too much trouble, perhaps because of her disabilities, perhaps because she'd fought too hard, they'd left her to die in the canyon rather than deal with the consequences of their crime. The girl seemed to sense his understanding and his anger on her behalf. She touched his arm gently, her eyes showing gratitude mixed with wariness. She appreciated his help, but she was still uncertain about his intentions. In her world, Samuel realized, a white man's kindness often came with a price. Returning to his medical supplies, Samuel showed her the clean cloth and bottle of whiskey, gesturing to her wounds. The girl nodded permission, though she tensed as he began cleaning the more serious cuts. Her ankle was definitely sprained, but not broken, and the head wound was superficial despite the dramatic amount of blood it had produced. As Samuel worked, he found himself thinking about the morning. The girl was right to be concerned about her people. They would indeed be searching for her, but they would also be suspicious of any white man found with one of their daughters, regardless of the circumstances. Samuel had heard too many stories of misunderstandings that had escalated into violence on both sides. He would need to find a way to return her safely to her tribe without getting himself killed in the process. But first, she needed rest and healing. Whatever trials awaited them in the daylight, tonight she was safe, warm and cared for. The girl's eyes were growing heavy again as the combination of exhaustion, injury, and relief took their toll. Samuel pulled his spare blanket over her, then settled into his wooden chair by the fire. He wouldn't sleep tonight, partly from vigilance, partly from the strange sensation of having another human being in his home after so many years of solitude. Outside, the Montana wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the promise of change. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Samuel had dozed fitfully in his chair, one ear always listening for sounds of approaching riders. The girl, he still didn't know her name, had slept deeply, her breathing steady and peaceful for the first time since he'd found her in the canyon. As the sky lightened from deep purple to soft gray, Samuel rose quietly and stoked the fire. Coffee would help him think clearly about what needed to happen next. The girl would need food when she woke, and he would need a plan for returning her safely to her people. But as he moved about his morning routine, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck told him the decision might not be his to make. Dolly's nervous whinny from the corral confirmed his suspicions. Samuel moved to the window and peered through the glass, his blood running cold at what he saw. Silhouetted against the rising sun, perhaps a dozen riders sat motionless on the ridge overlooking his property. Even at this distance, he could make out the distinctive profiles of Native American warriors, their horses standing patient and still as statues. They had found her trail. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, leaning against the wall near the door, but he forced himself to stop. Reaching for a weapon now would be the worst possible choice. These men were here for the girl, and any aggressive action on his part would likely end with him dead and his cabin burned to the ground. His only hope lay in somehow communicating his peaceful intentions and the circumstances of how he'd found their daughter. Behind him, he heard a soft rustling as the girl stirred on the bed. She sat up slowly, wincing as her injuries made themselves known, then froze as she saw Samuel's tense posture at the window. Following his gaze, she looked out and gasped. Not audibly, but her intake of breath was sharp and visible. The girl's face transformed with a mixture of relief and concern. These were her people, but she understood as well as Samuel the dangerous position they were all in. A white man found with a Native American girl could mean only one thing to warriors who had spent generations fighting to protect their families from exactly such situations. Moving quickly despite her injured ankle, the girl joined Samuel at the window. She studied the riders intently, and Samuel saw recognition flash across her features. She knew them, probably family members and tribal warriors who had been searching for her. But instead of rushing to signal them, she turned to Samuel with an expression of deep worry. She began signing rapidly, her hands moving in urgent, flowing gestures. Though Samuel couldn't understand the specific words, her meaning was clear. She was trying to warn him, to explain the danger he was in simply by having helped her. Her dark eyes showed genuine fear, not for herself, but for him. "It's all right," Samuel said softly, knowing she couldn't hear him but hoping his tone conveyed calm reassurance. "We'll figure this out." The girl shook her head vigorously, then pointed to the back of the cabin and made running motions with her fingers. She wanted him to flee, to escape before her people descended on his homestead. But Samuel shook his head firmly. Running would only confirm whatever suspicions they might have about his intentions. His only chance lay in facing them directly and honestly. Movement on the ridge caught their attention. The riders were beginning to descend, their horses picking their way carefully down the rocky slope. Samuel could see them more clearly now, weathered men with the hard faces of warriors, carrying rifles and wearing the traditional clothing of what he guessed might be Blackfoot or Crow. Their leader, riding slightly ahead of the others, was an older man whose grey-streaked hair was bound with leather and feathers. The girl suddenly grabbed Samuel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. When he looked at her, she was pointing to herself and then making a series of gestures that seemed to indicate explanation or storytelling. She wanted to be the one to communicate with her people, to tell them what had really happened. Samuel nodded, understanding. She knew her people's ways, their language, their customs. If anyone could prevent this situation from erupting into violence, it would be her. But he also knew that her disabilities might make communication difficult, especially if she needed to convey complex ideas quickly. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and soon Samuel could hear voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. The warriors were calling out, their voices carrying across the morning air with a mixture of urgency and controlled anger. They had found what they were looking for, and they were preparing for confrontation. Samuel made a decision. Moving slowly and deliberately, he walked to the cabin door and stepped outside, his hands visible and empty. The girl tried to follow, but he gestured for her to wait inside where she would be safe from any initial violence that might occur. The warriors had spread out in a semicircle around his property, their rifles ready but not yet aimed. Their leader, the grey-haired man Samuel had spotted earlier, rode forward until he was perhaps 20 yards away. Up close, Samuel could see the deep lines around his eyes, the scars on his hands and arms that spoke of a lifetime of battles and hardships. This was a man who had earned his authority through strength and wisdom. "White man," the leader said in accented but clear English, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You have something that belongs to us." Samuel kept his hands visible and his voice steady. "I found an injured girl on the ghost trail. She's safe inside, recovering from her wounds." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You found her? You did not take her?" "I found her abandoned, hurt and unconscious. She would have died if I'd left her there." A murmur ran through the other warriors, some of whom were shifting restlessly in their saddles. Samuel could feel the tension in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, and this would end badly for everyone. "Show us," the leader commanded. Samuel nodded and turned back toward the cabin. As he reached the door, the girl appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. When she saw the assembled warriors, her expression lit up with joy and relief. She called out in sign language, her hands moving rapidly in what was clearly an urgent explanation. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The warriors lowered their weapons, their hostile postures relaxing as they watched the girl's frantic signing. The leader's stern expression gradually shifted to one of amazement, then something approaching awe. The girl continued her story, pointing to Samuel, to the canyon, to her own injuries. She was telling them everything, how she'd been taken, how she'd been abandoned to die, how Samuel had found her and cared for her through the night. Her signs grew more emphatic as she described his kindness, his respect, his refusal to take advantage of her helpless condition. When she finished, silence fell over the gathering. The leader studied Samuel with new eyes, taking in his simple clothing, his weathered hands, the modest cabin and struggling farm. This was not the homestead of a man who trafficked in human misery or sought to exploit the vulnerable. "She says you saved her life," the leader said finally. "She says you treated her with honor." Samuel nodded, unsure how to respond. The girl moved to stand beside him, her gesture clearly indicating her support and gratitude. Despite her injuries, despite the cultural and language barriers between them, she was standing up for him in front of her own people. The leader dismounted and walked forward, his warriors following suit. But instead of the confrontation Samuel had expected, the older man extended his hand in a gesture of respect. "I am Standing Bear, chief of the Northern Wind Band," he said, as Samuel clasped his hand. "And you, white man, have done something that changes everything." Standing Bear's weathered hand remained clasped with Samuel's as the morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the Montana plains. Around them, the other warriors had dismounted and were speaking quietly among themselves in their native tongue, their earlier hostility replaced by something Samuel couldn't quite identify, respect, perhaps, or even reverence. "You do not understand what you have done," Standing Bear said, his dark eyes searching Samuel's face. "The girl you saved, her name is Silent Moon. She is my granddaughter and she is sacred to our people." Samuel glanced at the girl, Silent Moon, who was watching the exchange with intelligent eyes. Despite her youth and disabilities, there was something about her presence that commanded attention, a quiet dignity that Samuel had sensed from the moment he'd found her. "Sacred?" Samuel asked, genuinely curious rather than skeptical. Standing Bear nodded slowly. "Among our people, those who cannot hear the sounds of this world are believed to hear the voices of the spirit world instead. Silent Moon is our bridge between the living and the ancestors. She guides us in matters of great importance." The old chief's voice carried deep emotion as he continued. 3 days ago she was taken by white men who thought to sell her, but the spirits would not allow such dishonor. They guided her captors to abandon her on the ghost trail, and they guided you to find her." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana morning air. "I don't understand." "The ghost trail is more than just a dangerous path," Standing Bear explained. "It is where our ancestors walked between worlds, No one survives there unless the spirits will it. You were chosen, Samuel Whitmore. The fact that Standing Bear knew his name shouldn't have surprised Samuel, but it did. The chief smiled at his expression. We have watched you for many seasons. A man who lives alone, who works his land with honor, who harms no one. The spirits have been preparing for this moment. Silent Moon stepped forward and began signing to her grandfather. Her movements were fluid and graceful, telling a story that seemed to captivate the assembled warriors. When she finished, Standing Bear's expression had transformed completely. She says the spirit spoke to her in dreams while she recovered in your cabin, he translated. They showed her your heart, pure and generous, untouched by the greed that poisons so many of your people. She says this land, where you showed such kindness, must be protected. Samuel looked around at his modest homestead, the struggling crops, the weathered barn, the simple cabin. Protected? Standing Bear raised his voice so all the warriors could hear, then spoke in his native language. The words carried weight and authority, and Samuel watched as the men around him straightened with understanding. Several of them began removing items from their saddlebags, small bundles wrapped in leather and cloth. I have declared your farm to be sacred ground, Standing Bear announced. This earth that absorbed my granddaughter's tears, that sheltered her in her time of greatest need, is now blessed by our people. No harm will come to you here. No enemy will prosper against you. The warriors began placing their bundles at various points around Samuel's property, small medicine bags and carved tokens that they pressed into the earth with reverent care. Silent Moon watched with approval, occasionally pointing to specific locations where she wanted the sacred objects placed. This is too much, Samuel protested. I only did what anyone should do. No, Standing Bear replied firmly. Most would have left her to die rather than risk trouble. You chose compassion over safety. That choice has consequences beyond what you can imagine. As the ceremony continued, Samuel found himself thinking about the years of loneliness, the failed harvests, the slow decay of his dreams. Perhaps this land had been waiting for something, not just crops to grow, but for a moment when its owner would prove worthy of something greater. Silent Moon approached him one final time. Her hands moving in the flowing sign language, he was beginning to recognize as beautiful rather than merely functional. When she finished, she pressed something into his palm, a small stone carved with symbols he couldn't read. She says this will help you understand when the spirits wish to speak, Standing Bear translated. And she says, thank you, not just for saving her life, but for treating her as a person worthy of respect. The sun was fully up now, and Samuel knew the warriors would soon need to leave. Standing Bear mounted his horse, then looked down at the white farmer, who had inadvertently changed everything. Your farm will prosper now, he said with quiet certainty. The spirits have seen your heart and they are pleased, but more importantly, you are no longer alone in this world. You have earned the friendship of the Northern Wind Band, and that is not something we offer lightly. As the riders prepared to depart, Silent Moon lingered for a moment longer. She pointed to the sunrise, then to Samuel, then made a gesture that encompassed the entire homestead. Her meaning was clear. This was a new beginning for all of them. Samuel watched until the last rider disappeared over the ridge, then looked down at the carved stone in his palm. The morning felt different now, charged with possibility rather than burdened by isolation. His land, his life, his future, all had been transformed by a simple act of human decency. For the first time in years, Samuel Whitmore smiled as he began his morning chores. The sacred ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with new life, and the horizon held promise instead of emptiness. The loner farmer had found his purpose at last.